It's finally here. Oh, thank God. Hello everyone, Mouse88 here with a new book review that I promised so long ago. Today we will be reviewing the book State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. Now this isn't the first book I went over that was by Lenin, but this is one of my favorite out of the two books he has written. I really like how this book was written, but I'll go over that at the end. Now I'll approach this book like I did on my previous reviews, so I'll break it up into 4 parts. Part 1 will be chapters 1 to 2, Part 2 will be chapters 3 to 4, Part 3 will be chapters 5 to 6, and the last part will be my thoughts. Now, let's dig deep into this gold mine. Okay, so right out of the gate on the first page on chapter 1, Lenin already calling out niggas for distorting Marxism. These include German bourgeois professors, social chauvinists, and other varying degrees of opportunists. He starts off with his first argument, quoting Engels and stating that the Marxist understanding of the state is that it is a product of class antagonisms, and that this is proof of class antagonisms are irreconcilable. So we can see here that the revisionists of his time and even today try to find ways to reconcile the class differences rather than actively seeking to abolish it. He goes on by saying that Marx stated that the state is an organ of class domination over another class. If it was possible for them to reconcile, there would be no need for a state. However, not all revisionists fall in this line. Some are more so than others. He gives his first example by saying, quote, "On the other hand, the Kautskyist distortion of Marx is far more subtle. Theoretically, there is no denying that the state is the organ of class domination, or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. But what is forgotten or glossed over is this. If the state is a product of the irreconcilable character of class antagonisms, if it is a force standing above society and increasingly separating itself from it, then it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible, not only without violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power, which was created by the ruling class in which this separation is embodied. As we shall see later, Marx drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion from a concrete historical analysis of the problems of revolution." End quote. So we can see here that the apparatus of said state as we know it will have to fall in order to achieve socialism. On the second part of chapter 1, Lenin goes over how Engels developed the conception of power. The state's power consists of this special bodies of armed men, or the army and the police. Lenin argues that these are the state's chief instruments to maintain power. Now note, he didn't specify on whether these instruments were good or bad. That is because depending on the state we are talking about determines if it is a positive or a negative. In this case, the former Russian Tsarist state, army and police, were that of a negative because it helped maintain a semi-feudal power to maintain control. Same can be said for America. Our army and police are used to help maintain power for the ruling class. Now, compare that to the People's Army or People's Police under a socialist country. This is a positive, as it helps squash out bourgeois influence and protects the people's interests from external imperial threats. The rest of Part 2 states that how the power was then rivaled was with conquest for the bourgeois class in order to gain wealth via imperialism. Part 3 of Chapter 1, Vlad goes over how these oppressors use the state for exploitation. He talks about the supposed democratic republics such as that in America, and how it is wealth that wields the power indirectly. Now we already can see this today with various influence on the senators, presidents, and so on and so forth. It's mainly from various donors who have a stake in various investments or corporate interests. He goes on to say that these so-called democratic republics are nothing more than a shell for capital that helps the ruling class maintain their interests. Under capital, there is no true democracy, but only suggestions selected by the ruling class to help maintain their wealth. Regardless of the multiple parties, the grand majority serve the needs of the ruling class. Now, before I move on to Part 4 of Chapter 1, I should point out one quote Lenin put near the end of Part 3. There's a quote by Engels stating that there has been really no need for a state's existence, as for the history of humanity we have gotten by without one. But due to economic development, classes began to form around the means of production and wealth, and for people to maintain that wealth, the formation of the state evolved over time. The formation of class began, but due to stages of evolution in terms of epoch or stages of development, Engels argued that the necessity is dying out, but he wasn't fully correct. It seems Engels thought he probably thought it would been dissolved by the 20th or 21st century, but he didn't foresee the neo-imperialism, nuclear weapons, and so on. Now, that is not to say that capital is invincible. As Rosa pointed out, capital cannot adapt. The contradictions within it will officially give way and break on its own, which, if revolution is carried out on the basis of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, should lead to a socialist society, and over time a communist one based on the material conditions given. Now, part 4 of chapter 1 is about the most well-known words in Marxism, the withering away of the state. He starts off with another Engels quote, which is quite lengthy. Quote, "The proletarian seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with, but thereby abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all classes, distinctions, and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as a state. Society thus far, operating amid class antagonisms, need the state, that is, an organization of a particular exploited class, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore, especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by a given mode of production, slavery, serfdom, or bondage, wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible cooperation, but it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for its own time society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of a slave-owning citizen, in the Middle Ages of the feudal nobility, and in our own time of the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based on the present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excess arising from this struggle are removed, nothing more remains to be held in subjection. Nothing necessitating a special coercive force, the state. The first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations become, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of process of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure of value of the phrase a free people state, both as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency. And also, the so-called anarchists demand that the state be abolished outright. End quote. Jesus, he had to choose a long-ass quote. But basically, that is what it means as the state withering away. The phenomena still exist, but in time when the contradictions are dealt with, shall in turn wither away. Now, of course, today we know the continuation of class struggle under socialism, as pointed out by Mao, and the need for cultural revolution and a protracted people's war. Now, even during Lenin's time, there were people that had distorted this view of the state that helped contribute to the bourgeois sense of thinking, as most people tend to misunderstand or purposely misconstrue putting an end to the state, when in reality the state we are talking about is the end of the bourgeois state, not of the worker state. Lenin says that the proletarian state will remain after a socialist revolution, and the withering is that of the worker state, which I already stated how it would have to go down not just 5 minutes ago. Next is the most key point in Marxist-Leninist Maoist theory, in that it is the necessity and justification of the state. Under the current state, workers and marginalized groups are oppressed. When the workers gain control of the system, where is there to stop from the bourgeois regaining power and fighting back? This organized group can't take down the reactionary force. There has to be a centralized apparatus to fight back. This is where Lenin and the proper understanding of Engels and Marx reinforces the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Worker state apparatus will purge the bourgeois out of society and fight back against the reactionary forces. Yes, this is not taking place of withering away of the state, as DOTP, or dictatorship of the proletariat, is a process of replacing a bourgeois state for a worker state. This is part of the transitioning process for socialism. Without a DOTP, the revolutionary forces will fall. In his third point, Lenin points out that Engels' quote of the seizure of production by the state after the socialist revolution means that of a complete democracy. When the bourgeois democratic society is overturned and the workers take control of the means of production via the state of a society, the democratic system shifts from a bourgeois-oriented one to a worker-oriented one. Lenin goes on to say some opportunists who distort Marx associate withering away of the state and the state being dormant. They think Engels is speaking of democracy. Lenin says that this is unintelligent, as bourgeois democracy is a product of the state apparatus, and that too will disappear as it serves a bourgeois purpose. He says that the state in general, the most complete democracy, or proletarian democracy, can only wither away. Now before we go on to chapter 2, there are 3 things I want to touch on in chapter 1. Okay, so first is on the ending of paragraph of page 18. Lenin states that Marx and Engels have argued that consequently, no state is either free or a people state. Now I can hear the leptons and anarchists screeching now, saying this is a gotcha. Okay, so here is why it's not. A state is a repressive force, but it is a necessary one when in terms of dealing with wanting to get rid of a class. The worker state, as I said multiple times, is needed to help suppress the bourgeois. The reason it is not a people state is that the term people is too general. We cannot lump in Nazis, conservatives, and liberals, etc. The focus is on the working class and eliminating class distinctions and reactionaries. This is the only logical way of establishing socialism. Second is a quote of Lenin I think you need to hear. Quote, "When Marxism is adulterated to become opportunism, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics is the best method for deceiving the masses. It gives an illusionary satisfaction, and it seems to take into account all sides of the process, all the tendencies of development, all the contradictory factors, and so on. Whereas in reality it offers no consistent revolutionary view of the process of social development at all." End quote. Lastly is that no proletarian state can come into existence without a violent revolution. Moving on to chapter 2, Lenin here gives us a history lesson of the differences of 1848 to 1851. Of course, he's mentioning the Paris Commune and other activities at the time. Lenin goes over the reason that the workers must attain control is that through overthrowing the bourgeois, they in turn can help stop the exploitation of other oppressed minorities, as the focus in a socialist system is to abolish class antagonism and further our understanding of science. In part 2 of chapter 2, Lenin goes on how the bourgeois state came into being, which he says it was during the period of when absolutism, or despotic rule, fell. He says the 2 institutions that had replaced this was bureaucracy and the standing army. The only reason that they managed to last so long was due to the petty bourgeois had been, giving aid to the big bourgeois. Not to mention the switch from feudalism to capitalism led the livelihoods of the upper peasantry, small artisans, and tradesmen to live a little more comfortable, as is to be expected. He later brings up that imperialism, a new component, has brought in a way to strengthen the state machinery, has helped grew the bureaucratic system along with the military. This of course led to further oppression of the workers. Now, the last part I have marked for chapter 2 is in part 3, where Lenin says that the theory of class struggle didn't even start with Marx, it actually came before him. He even goes on to say that just because you recognize class struggle, does that mean you're a Marxist? If at all, the term class struggle is actually a very safe term. What is dangerous, however, in terms of, what revolution is just limiting Marxism to that of a teaching of class struggle. In other words, just keeping it academic, Richard Wolff, and not expanding it to that of the next step, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat, is a form of opportunism in bourgeois academia. It's useless. Chapter 3 is Lenin going over Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune. I have nothing marked in part 1, so we'll go over part 2, which asks the question, what is supposed to replace the state machinery? Lenin says that Marx answered this question in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx says, quote, "The proletariat organized as the ruling class," end quote, and by also, quote, "establishing democracy," end quote. And that Marx avoided a utopic view by waiting to experience a mass movement of workers to come about and set one up. When the Paris Commune formed, Marx analyzed this to help further his theory. Now, Marx states the Paris Commune had showed itself to be the antithesis to that of the French Empire and showed that they surpassed class rule by having quote-unquote fuller democracy. But Lenin says that the Commune would only appear to have replaced the state machinery only in terms of democracy. Whilst the Commune got rid of the standing army and transferred into a people's democracy, they only did it by replacing one form of institution to another entirely different one. He says that this is an example of transformation of quantity into quality. It was still a state, but a different kind of state, one that wanted to crush the current one of the empire. This state, however, was not one in the traditional sense at the time. Lenin goes on to say that the reason it fell was due to the lack of suppressing the bourgeois. It was still a new phenomenon after all, and we have learned from their mistakes. And theorists such as Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Gonzalo have expanded upon this to ensure a victory for future worker revolutions. In part 3 of chapter 3, the subject of parliamentarianism is brought up. Lenin brings up how Marx opposed the utopian view of a new society and that he had studied natural history of each new society prior. He goes over that to destroy officialdom right off the bat is the thinking of a utopian. Lenin argues that we must break up the old bureaucratic bourgeois machine and to construct a new one based on the proletarian to gradually reduce the officialdom. Now, I know this sounds sus, but we must remember that with worker control and the wealth being taken away from the bourgeois, this can help reduce the inequality. Add in the mass line, cultural revolution, democratic essentialism, and planned economics, we can reduce the bureaucratic system. Quote, "We are not utopians. We do not indulge in dreams of how best to do away immediately with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon a lack of understanding of the task of the proletarian dictatorship, are basically foreign to Marxism. And a matter of fact, they serve but to put off the socialist revolution until human nature is different. No, we want the socialist revolution with human nature as it is now, with human nature that cannot do without subordination, control, and managers." End quote. This is what separates us from the anarchists. We oppose idealism of immediate destruction of the state. Now, I am aware that not all anarchists are monolithic. There are very different anarchists with very different ideas. Now, some don't oppose an immediate teardown of the state. As I heard, some support some dumbass ideas and some not as dumb, but still deserve critique. Now, the first dumbass idea is that voting for a social democrat will somehow help us get to a socialist system or at least leave people wanting more. Not knowing that's never worked before. Now, the second dumbass idea I've heard of that is of market anarchism. Now, this is usually paired with syndicalism. This is a different form of market as it's not based on capital. But like its Adam Smith counterpart, the model still suffers from pure fucking idealism. Whilst they support pro-labor positions and anti-hierarchy, the support for markets stems from the idea that if under a syndicate they can avoid issues of capital and fight back against the exploitation. They argue that, quote, "it is we collectively who decide who controls the means of production," end quote. And whilst that sounds good and more preferable than a capitalist system, it still suffers the errors of possible corruption, no state power over the bourgeois threat, and the fact that according to Marxists such as David McNally have even argued that Marx stated that markets have inherently produced inequitable outcomes and will eventually lead to that of inequality. And that's pretty fucking bad. The last idea that I think is, well, dumb but not as dumb as the previous is that of a hybrid of Maoist principles with anarchist tactics. And whilst that sounds like it could work, I fear they will end up like the Paris Commune. Yes, they advocate for mass line in some form of protracted people's war, but like the Commune, if they do not have a state power, they will be crushed. Not to mention, Lenin stated earlier, this phenomenon of a commune is still a form of a state. This is why the workers need to control the large-scale production and transform the capitalist mode into a socialist mode. And then the process of withering away the state will begin if MLM principles are applied. Okay, so part 4 of chapter 3 talks about national unity. Lenin goes over Marx's view of the state and his opposition to federalism. Lenin says that Marx is often confused for a federalist by petty bourgeois and anarchists, but in reality, Marx was a centralist. Lenin says the difference is that the destruction of the state is not the same as the destruction of centralism. Centralism, Lenin says, will lead the workers to gain power and overturn the capitalist state machinery, transfer the means of production to the workers, and confiscation of the wealth from the bourgeois. Quote, Marx, as though he foresaw the possibility of the perversion of his ideas, purposely emphasizes that the accusation against the commune that it desired to destroy the unity of the nation, to do away with central power, was a deliberate falsehood. Marx purposely uses the phrase to organize the unity of the nation so as to contrast conscious democratic proletariat centralism to bourgeois, military, bureaucratic centralism. End quote. Part 5 of Chapter 3, he states that Marx deducted that the history of socialism will lead to the dissolvement of the state. For it to do so, the proletariat would have to be organized as a new ruling class in order to transfer to socialism and then to communism. Marx had based this off on his analysis of the Revolution of France and what mistakes they made and what needed to happen in order for it to succeed. In Chapter 4, Lenin goes over the supplementary explanations by Engels. And the only thing in Part 1 I feel interested in going over is him summarizing Engels' position on housing. Engels states that the proletarian state will still have rent and bills, but under a different sense than that of capital. You see, under capital, bills and rent are used to accumulate wealth for one section or person of a certain class. But under a socialist transition, rent is a deduction of a common fund to help keep up the housing infrastructure. There will be no more need for the parasites known as landlords, as the pay then goes to the workers' state as they help organize and upgrade housing infrastructure. Okay, so part 2 of chapter 4 is a polemic against the anarchists. So I have already went over the various points against anarchists for the past while now. What else could I possibly go on now? Well, it should be stated, communist anarchists still agree that the aim is to abolish the state. But where we differ is how we should do it. He goes over Engels' piece on authority, which I went over and have a video on, albeit I think I could have done better, and I might even redo it later on. So, moving on to part 3. Part 3 goes over a letter wrote by Engels to Bebel, basically going over terminology, semantics, and other issues. I had no markings here, or I did, but I don't find it interesting to go over, so we're going to go over part 4. Now, part 4 goes over the critiques of the draft of Erfurt programs. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I'm not fluent in German. On page 60, Lenin reiterates that centralism and federalism are not necessarily the same thing. It says that Engels, like Marx, had insisted that democratic centralism in one indivisible republic, and that the Federal Republic was considered by Engels to be either an exception or a hindrance towards the development of a new system. This fits with the time as Lenin wrote this because feudalism and semi-feudalism countries still existed, and for them to reach socialism they needed to transfer over to capitalism first, as one cannot skip the order of human production. It goes as follows: primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and then communism. Lenin goes on to say that Engels does not mean democratic centralism is in the same sense of bourgeois and petty bourgeois bureaucratic sense. Engels had argued that centralism does not exclude local self-government, which has combined a voluntary defense of the unity for the state. Now, an example of this were the various communes under Mao's China, some of which already reached a communist-like state, yet they still were allowed to exist as they helped defend the unity of the republic of the country and upheld Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Part 5 goes over the 1891 preface to Marx's Civil War in France. There is only one paragraph I want to go over. Lenin says that to develop democracy to its logical conclusion, there must be a form for its development. The only way it can come about is through practice of struggle to a socialist revolution. Not one form of democracy will just yield socialism, that is opportunism and help feeding the bourgeois machine. But in socialism, we will achieve democracy, for it is impossible to have socialism without democracy. You cannot separate the two. Democracy under socialism will exert its influence on economic life and in turn its development. This is based on the dialectics of history. Now, Part 6 goes over Engels' notion of overcoming of democracy. There are 2 paragraphs that must be gone over. First is Lenin saying that no democracy is not identical with that of the subordination of the minority to the majority, but that democracy is the state of recognizing the subordination of the minority to the majority, such as the systematic use of violence and so on. The second paragraph states that, quote, "We set ourselves the ultimate aim of abolishing the state, i.e. all organized and systematic violence, all use of violence against people in general. We do not expect the advent of system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed. In striving for socialism, however, we are convinced that it will develop into communism and, therefore, that the need for violence against people in general for the subordination of one man to another and of one section of the population to another will vanish altogether, since people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination." End quote. Now, this cannot be obtained with proper theory and praxis, and all of this has to be based on dialectical materialism. Chapter 5 covers the economic base of the state withering away. Part 1 goes over Marx's formulation, which goes over Marx's scientific answer of how the state transforms. Part 2 is where the subject of transition of capitalism to communism comes in. Lenin says that transferring to a communist society is impossible without a transition period, and that the state can only be revolutionary if it has a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now on page 78, Lenin argues for how the transitional period would be set up. It will need to have a DOTP, a vanguard of the oppressed people as the new ruling class to help squish out bourgeois influence and other reactionary forces. This is when the democracy of the old state changes from the rich to that of the working class. The DOTP limits the liberties of the ruling class in order to help take them down. We must restrict the ruling class by not giving them rights and causing terror against them to ensue the working class remains on top. This is where the necessity of such phenomena such as the Red Terror come in. You cannot have a worker state if there are still remnants of the ruling class lurking around and fighting back. This sounds rough, I know. A revolution is no bloody tea party. In a video game, of course. This is all going to happen in a video game. I just have to make that clear now, But how do you think capitalism has managed for so long? One of the key reasons was the oppression of the workers and other marginalized groups. They will not peacefully give up their power, but only want to maintain it. Later, Lenin says that when there is no class, the state can begin to wither away. Now, it must be known that Lenin didn't get to see the production of the new material conditions that would make use of nuclear weapons. He originally thought that capitalism was such a contradiction it would just lead to a series of world wars. He was as right as we did get to World War II. Remember, he saw World War I, but he did not foresee nuclear weapons in the Cold War. That was a new phenomenon. Of course, Mao Zedong would formulate a new theory around that, at least for China, and that had been synthesized in 1988 by Chairman Gonzalo. The withering away of the state is not quick and will take time, but if we ignore the material conditions, we end up failing and falling over like that of the Paris Commune, the C&T, and Rosa. Now, part 3 goes over the first phase of communism. The first phase of communism, or socialism, will not produce justice, equality, and difference in wealth, which is to be expected, as this is the beginning stages of a new society. What will change, according to Lenin, is that the exploitation of man to man will stop, as private property will either be collectivized, nationalized by the proletariat state, and worker-controlled businesses with a Soviet model, meaning that the workers will have representatives voted in for on behalf of their interests. This will be in the immediate change. Now, part 4 goes over the higher stage of communism, which, is full-blown communism. This is where when the material conditions are met and the need for the state is no longer necessary. Now, as Lenin states in page 80, the stupidity of the idea of a quick reach to communism has never even entered the mind of a socialist. Only those that are idealistic, stupid, or just beginning to learn Marxism will think that. Quote, "Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state of the quantity of labor and the quantity of consumption. Only this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalist, with the control of the workers over the capitalist. It must be carried out, not by a state bureaucrat, but by a state of armed workers." End quote. This reaffirms our justification for the state in order to transition. This last thing I want to go over is that of democracy. Lenin says democracy is the greatest importance for the working class. He says that this is the greatest importance for them to achieve freedom from the capitalist, but is a part of a stepping stone of the stages of development, as democracy means equality, and the only way that it can be put into action is through socialism and then communism, and we can only get there through the science of MLM. Now, Chapter 6 goes over the vulgarization of Marx by the opportunist. Part 1 is Plenkov's polemic against the anarchists. In one passage, Lenin brings up how the anarchists tried to claim the Paris Commune as their own. In it, he poses the question as to what the anarchists will replace with the old state machinery. This is just one question, though. I have another one. What about the issue of the potential reactionaries? What about the issue of warding off bourgeois culture? And how do we skip, to reach communism? How do you skip socialism to reach communism? Now, as I stated earlier, they came up with various solutions in that all anarchists are not really monolithic, as again each has a different idea. At best, they're going to either capitulate or fall. That's actually what history has shown us each time. Okay, so part 2 is Kautsky's polemic against the opportunist. Quote, Kautsky has not in the least understood the difference between bourgeois parliamentarism, combining bourgeois democracy, not for the people, with bureaucracy, against the people, and proletarian democracy, which will take immediate steps to cut down bureaucracy at the roots, and which will be able to carry out these measures to their conclusion, the complete destruction of bureaucracy and the final establishment of democracy for the people. End quote. This is to show that Kautsky had not read Marx's quote, that, quote, the commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time, end quote. Now, Lenin argues that Kautsky has a reverence for bureaucracy and the state, and that he goes, he gone back on Marx's works in 1852, which makes Kautsky a fucking revisionist. Ugh. Part 3 was Kautsky's polemic against Pinnacle, and I think I may have spelled that wrong or got the name wrong. Listen, by the time I was writing the script yesterday, my brain was already fried, and all the Russian names start to look alike to me, so I'm going to try to power through this. Alright, so most of this part compares communists to anarchists, and most I've already said over and over again. But this quote I found looks interesting enough to, give a look. Quote, Kautsky's quotation is neither here nor there. The new state machinery emits centralism as much as the old. If the workers voluntarily unify their armed forces, this will be centralism. But it will be based on the complete destruction of the centralized state apparatus, the army, police, bureaucracy. Kautsky acts just like a swindler when he ignores the perfectly well-known arguments of Marx and Engels on the commune and one out with a quotation which has nothing to do with the case, end quote. This is of course in response to Kautsky's so-called gotcha against Pinnacle, when he, Kautsky, purposely misquoted Marx, accusing Pinnacle of wanting to destroy centralism, when in reality, Pinnacle did no such thing. He didn't say anything like that. Kautsky, just got sad and tried to discredit actual Marxists. On the second to last page, Lenin says the history of the commune has not only been forgotten but distorted by the opportunists to ignore the state's role in the revolution. This has played in favor of the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois, and this is often pushed by academic quote-unquote Marxists and anarchists today, only keeping the goal of socialism and communism as an ideal and not a reality. Jesus Christ, 30 fucking minutes. I didn't expect this to be long. So to conclude, we learned that the state is more than that of a tool of oppression for the ruling class, but a necessity for the working class to use to oppress the bourgeois. And in protracted people's war, mass lying, and cultural revolution, you can safeguard the revolution to help maintain a proper transition from capital to socialism and socialism to communism. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the key way to help transfer the wealth of the few to that of the people. The new democracy will be different and be based on one party, as there should only be one party to represent the working class and the marginalized people. The state will also help with the nationalization, collectivization, and transfer of private property to public property. All these are necessities to carry out a successful revolution. This is a social science known as Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, to help carry the people forward on the basis of dialectical materialism. To ignore this is beyond infuriating and ignorant. Only those that are petty bourgeois, ignorant to Marxism, which can be fixed with one, studying more on the subject, our revisionists/opportunists will argue against this for a more nicer and easier, right, that fits their ideals. Whether that be voting for social democrats, not organizing, only talking about co-ops, or fetishizing academia, all are a cancer to leftism. Oh boy, that was a rant. Anyway, this book was a very good read, very engaging and easy to digest. Lennon brilliantly defends and justifies the need of a worker state and debunking opportunist and anarchist arguments against it. I highly recommend this book. It is needed to understand Marxism, Leninism, Maoism in general. It is one of two of my favorite books by Lenin, the other being Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. I cannot recommend this enough. Anyway, that will be it for today. I would like to thank my comrade, Maoist Red Sun. He has a YouTube channel, by the way, Maoist Red Sun, for helping me write the script. I also like to thank, everyone who supported me. And the next video I'm going to do will be that of Protracted People's War. So, yeah, get ready for that. And anyway, this is Mouse88. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like it if you liked it, dislike it if you dislike it, critique me if you have any, critiques. And, yeah, Godspeed, stay safe, and peace out, niggas.